Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printed here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a very simple diary app in Django. So the reason why I'm showing you this app is because it illustrates many common things that you would do in Django or any web app in general. So I think it's a good starter project. This is actually the free course called Intro to Django on my website, and it's the first part of one of my premium courses called Understanding Django. So I recorded the videos in pieces, so I'm combining them for the YouTube video, so the transitions will be a little abrupt, but all the information will be there. If you want to get the code for this video, I will have it in the description below so you can get that. And I hope you enjoy the video. Just make sure you go to my website, prettyprinted.com, and check out the courses after you watch this video so you can see what else I have on the website. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. To start, these are the two HTML files that I am going to be working with. So I have one called index and one called add. And the reason why I have these is because what I like to do when creating an app is create the visual part first, so the HTML. And then once that's done, I can move to using it in Django and making it dynamic. And the reason why I do that is because it's easier to separate the two parts than to combine them. Because when you combine them, you have to think about how it's going to look and how it works at the same time. Whereas if you separate them, first you can concern yourself with how it looks, and then you can concern yourself with how to make it work in the way that you want to work. So you should be able to visually create your apps before you even integrate Django, because the in output of any app is going to be HTML. So you can always write that first. So I have that here. And of course, another reason is HTML takes a while to write, and it will make all the videos much longer if I wrote all the HTML in the videos. But here are the two files that I have, and these are what I'll be using. So as you can see, it's a very simple app. It has a list of diary entries that are added. And here is a page where you can actually type in a new diary entry, hit submit, and it gets added. And then, of course, it will appear in this list with the date and the time. So now that you see that, what we want to do now is we want to actually create a Django project and then create the app inside of the project to create this diary. So I'll go to my command line. And of course, make sure you have Django installed in your virtual environment activated if you're using a virtual environment. And to begin, what I'll do is I'll type Django-admin project, start project, and then give it a name. So the name of this project for me is going to be dear_diary. And then once you do that, it will have created a new directory for you. So in this case, dear diary. And inside of Dear Diary is going to be another directory with the exact same name, and I'll discuss that in a moment. And then there's a manage.py file. So what I'll do is I'll open this in my editor. So the Dear Diary directory, that's the one that's important. And then if I look here on the manage.py file, you see it has some code in here. You never want to change this code. This is for executing Django commands, but this is just what it looks like. And then you have this Dear Diary directory that has 4 files in it. So there's the init.py file with nothing in it, just making Dear Diary a module. There's a settings file, and it has a bunch of settings that are relevant to the project that you're working on. The one I'll change is the time zone. So I'll change this to Americas/Los_Angeles as my time zone. And the other settings I'll talk about as they become relevant. And then URLs is a file that handles the URLs that are, typed into the browser or just used in any tool that can perform a request. And then basically that URL is handled here. So the URL is looked at, and it will check if it matches any of the patterns here. If it does, it will send the app to that part. So as you can see right now, we only have admin, and it does something with admin.site.urls. And then finally, we have WSGI, and this is just something for the server, so the server can actually run the app. So really the most important file out of all of these is URLs and settings. So with that, I can now create an app. And creating an app is basically creating a very specific function of your project. So the way that Django used the word app is a little different from how app is typically used. When we think about an app, we normally think about everything combined, like everything that something does. Like you go to a website and everything that website can do for you. So for example, Facebook, you can log into Facebook, you can view the timeline, you can join a group and post messages in a group. You can chat with someone over Facebook Messenger. You can post pictures, etc. We consider all of those things to be part of the Facebook app. But in Django, app means a very specific part of a project. So if you were to use the same word twice, an app in Django would be a specific function of the app as you think about it. So to be more clear about that, let's say we had a Facebook project. Instead of calling it an app, let's call it a project. So an app in terms of Django, that would be something like logging in. So the user functionality. So just that part of Facebook would be an app. Another app would be the timeline. So just the part that displays the timeline and allows you to add information to your timeline or your feed, whatever they call it for Facebook. Another could be photos, which allows you to view your photos and add new photos. Another could be groups. So an app that handles listing groups, joining groups, posting to groups, reading groups, etc. So just think of an app as a very specific part of your app or your project. And, I use the word wrong too, because it's just kind of a weird name to have for it, but that's what it's called in Django. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing it. And as you get practice with Django, you'll probably come up with better apps in terms of separating them. And the nice thing about an app is you can move it from project to project. So if you think something is specific for your app, but it could potentially be used for another project, then it should be contained in an app. And like I said, this just comes with experience. So what I'll do is I'll create an app for this project, and I only need one app because I'm only concerned with adding diary entries to the database. So I'll just call this app entries. So what I want to do is I want to run manage.py. So I can either type Python manage.py or I can type /manage.py and then start app. And then what I want to do is I want to name this app. So I'm going to name my app entries. And it's complaining about my time zone. So I just need to remove an extra S. So America's Los Angeles, it's not a time zone. It should be America, Los Angeles. But as you can see, it gives you pretty useful errors. So I'll start the app entries again. And it has created another directory in my project. In this directory, it has more in it. There's a migrations directory. There's init.py, admin, apps, models, tests, and views. And we'll go through all those files next. Okay, so now let's take a look at all the files that were included when we created this new app called entries. So first, let's take a look at the migrations directory. There's nothing in it except an init.py file, but that will actually have some things in it a little later. So I'll go back to that once we do put some things in there. Another init.py, it just makes entries a module. Then admin.py. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to register your models so they can appear on the admin dashboard. And I'll show you the admin dashboard in just a moment. Then we have apps. So this is just a configuration file in a sense. You don't have to modify anything in apps. And then models is probably the most important one for most web apps if you are saving data to the database. So models controls what you save to the database. Tests are for any tests that you may write for your app. And then finally, views is another important file. This is what handles what the user sees. So the URL comes in, and then that URL is used to determine what view is called. And then you'll have some views in here that kind of handle what is supposed to happen when the user gets a response. So in most cases, some data comes in, they're submitting a form. The view will handle saving that data to the database and then redirecting them to a new page telling them that they've submitted to the form, something like that. So we'll be using this file quite a bit. And then that's it. So those are the files for entries. And, as we use them, this is just like a quick overview as we built this app. But as we use them, you'll see how they come into play for everything. So I mentioned before about the admin dashboard, and we can actually see that if we run our app. But the first thing I have to do is I need to do something called migrate. So basically migrate means take the things that are supposed to be in the database, make sure they're there. If they're not there, actually create them in the database. So what I'm going to be doing when I migrate is I'm going to be creating the user tables in the database. And these are already set up for me, so I don't have to do anything except run this command. So just if you take a look at this command, so manage.py, and then the command that I want to run is called migrate. And as you can see, it just did a bunch of things. It says applying and then something after. And basically what this is doing is it's creating tables in the database. So the most important tables for my purpose are the user tables. So you can see alter user, alter user, alter user, alter validators, and so on. Basically, these are the models that were created by the creators of Django. So they're already there for us and we can use them. And with that, we have kind of functionality to handle users out of the box. So to demonstrate this, the first thing I need to do is I need to create a super user so I can actually log into the admin dashboard. So I'll run another command called create super user. So create super user. And then I can just use my name, and then I'll put in my email address. And then I'll put in a password. And my password is going to be password 11 with a capital P. Okay, so it tells me the super user was created successfully. So now what I can do is I can actually start my server. So the command is going to be run server after manage.py, of course. And then once you do that, the dev server is going to be running on your computer. And here is the address. So 127.0.0.1 port 8000. So what I'll do is I'll simply go to that URL and we see this page. So if you did everything correctly, you should see this page just telling you that Django was installed correctly. Now, once you start adding things to your project, this will go away and it will be replaced by whatever you add. But once you start the app for the first time and you haven't added anything else, this is what displays. And if you want to see the admin dashboard, you simply append /admin to the URL and it gives you this nice login screen. Then you can type in your username and the password that you just created when you use create super user, hit login. And then on the left-hand side here, we see two things. We see groups and users. And these are actually tables in my database. So it's just using a SQLite database by default. If I show you my project directory again, where is it? There's a db.sqlite3 here. And basically that SQLite 3 table is, or that database is a SQLite database. So all the data is getting saved to db.sqlite3. So if I go back here and if I click groups, I don't see anything because I don't have any groups set up. But if I click users, I see my name, Anthony. If I click on it, it has all the information that I just put in. So my username is Anthony. The password is actually hashed, but it's password 11, just gets hashed before getting saved to the database. So the raw password doesn't get stored. Personal info, I can put in my name here if I wanted to. I'll just do that. It has some check boxes for permissions, so active, staff status, and super user status. It has a selection for available groups, but since there are no groups in my database, there's nothing to add here. And it also has something for permissions. And I have permissions in the database, so I can add them, but they don't really make sense in my app because I don't use permissions for anything, at least not in this particular one. And then we see last login and date join. So down here, I can either delete, I can save and add another, I can save and continue editing, or I can just hit save. So since I added my first and last name, I'll hit save. Now for our purposes with this project, we won't need any of this information, but it's just to show you what Django gives you right out of the box. So that's basically the admin dashboard. And with that out of the way, the next thing we can do is we can actually start building things for our specific project in this app entries. Now what I want to do is I want to get those HTML files into my app. So right now I'm just looking at them outside. They're just plain HTML files. And I want to add them into my app as templates. I won't modify them as templates to begin with, but having them as a template allows you to add the dynamic parts into the HTML. And of course, that will all make sense once I get to that part. But for now, I'll just simply add in the templates. So what I'm going to do in my entries directory, I'm going to create a new directory called templates. And then inside of that directory, I'm going to create a new directory called entries. And the reason why I'm doing this is because when you have multiple apps, what Django is going to do with all the templates directories is combine them. And it's very common to have HTML files with the same name. Like, for example, index.html is a very common name. And if I didn't have this subfolder called entries, then the index in this templates directory would potentially conflict with the index in some other templates directory in another app. So by adding the name of the app in the templates directory, it allows me to access that template by using entries/index. So just keep that in mind. It's not strictly necessary in this case because there's only going to be one app. But if you have a project with multiple apps, that could become an issue. So inside of that directory, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply put these into the directory I just created. So templates, entries, and then add an index. So with those there, I can now see the code for the files. And it's just simple HTML. It's from the CSS framework is Bulma, and I have that included here with the CDN, so you don't have to include any CSS files. These are basically the only two things that you need, these two files, and of course you can download these files from the link below. So now to display these, there are a couple of things I need to do. First, I need to set up a URL for each one, and then I need to set up a view to return the templates. And actually the view kind of comes first. So what I'll do is I'll go to views and I'll create the view. So like I said before, the view handles what comes after someone types in an address into the bar. So basically you type in an address to part of your site. And if I go to the URLs for the main project, you'll see here. So basically if you type admin, so this is anything that follows the domain. So in the case here, it's the domain port 8000/admin. So /admin is the part it's looking at. If it matches that admin, which it does in my case, then it's going to direct the user to these URLs. And these are set up for me by Django. I can't see them in my project, but they're there. And those URLs are more specific for each part of admin. So it's basically the same thing that I'll be doing for my URLs. And in views, once you've hit a URL that you're interested in, it gets forwarded to a view where the view actually handles the information that gets sent along with the URL request, and then it handles returning something back to the user. So to demonstrate that, I'll create an index or a view called index. So def index, and then it takes in a parameter called request. This is going to be the request information that comes in. And then every view has to return something. So in this case, I want to return the template so they can see it. So I'm simply going to type return. And then if you look up here, there's already this import render. That render is used to display a view, or a template, I should say. So return and then render. And the first argument that you need to pass to render is the same request that was passed into the view. So request, and then you pass the name of the template. So in this case, I want to use entries/index.html because that's the folder structure that I used before. And with that, I'm done with the views for now. I'll do the other file in just a moment. But now I want to handle the URLs. So I need to create a new file called urls.py. And I'm going to go to the urls.py in my Dear Diary directory, and I'm just going to copy it because it's a little faster that way. And I'm going to put this into entries. And I'll remove the parts that aren't relevant. So admin, and I'll save it. And basically, you need to append things to this URL patterns list. So in my case, I want the index to display when they hit the index. So basically nothing is after the domain. And then this part is going to be the view that they should get sent to. So to handle this, I need to import that view. So from period, so from the current module, which is entries, import views is what I'll do. And then I'll type views.index here. So whenever it lands on the index URL or path, it sends the user to the views.index view, which is this function here in my views.py file. And I need to modify the URLs for the project very slightly because this is the entry point for all the URLs when someone is using your app. It starts here and it looks for the path here. If it doesn't find the path, then it returns a 404 saying that it doesn't exist. Well, I created a separate URLs file, so I have to include that here. So I'm going to import include along with path here. And then I'll create a second path and it's just going to be blank. So this is basically saying if I pass in a domain that doesn't match anything, then forward it to the URLs here. So blank, and then I'm going to use include. And now I have to specify the app name, so entries, and then the name of the file, so URLs. And once I have those two things, I should have everything set up. So I'm going to start my server again, run server, and I'm going to go to the domain again. I get this template does not exist @ So what that means is it's looking for the template, but it just can't find it. And the reason why I can't find it is because I didn't add my entries app to my project apps. So I'll open up the settings.py file and then I'll go over to installed apps. And what I need to do is I need to add the app that I created. So entries here. And what that does is it's telling Django to actually look for the entries app. And one of the things that it will do is it will take the templates in that app and put them into the overall project templates directory. So if I save that and run the app again, I now see the Dear Diary page, and this is the index. So if I want to add the other template in, so let me close that, and I can close the other URLs. I want to add a second view. So I'll just call this add, and then return render requests, and then entries/add.html. And then I'll go to my URLs file and I'll create the path. So the path that I want is simply add. And by convention, you have a trailing slash in Django. You don't need a leading slash, just a trailing one, because it kind of chops off the URL up until that point. And then I'll add, well, outside of the parentheses, views.add. And when I do that, I should be able to see the add directory, or not the directory, but the endpoint when I go to add. And I see that here. So if I try something else like new, it gives me a page not found because it's only looking for these 3 URLs. And you can actually see it here. These are basically the endpoints that it's looking for. So I only have admin, blank, which is the index, and add. So if I hit add again, then it takes me to this page. If I go back to the index, then it takes me here. So I'm viewing the templates that I have through the URLs. So I no longer have to just view raw HTML files. They are now part of my app. Now that I have the templates working, what I want to do is I want to update this little link here. So there's only one link in my app. It's very simple. And basically I want this to go to the add new entry page. So right now it doesn't do anything. And to make it go to the add entry page, I'll go to my index.html. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that link. So here it's just a hash, meaning it doesn't do anything. And here I need to put in the URL for this page. So I could just do something like this, /add, and that would definitely work. But if I were to change the URL or the endpoint for whatever reason, then it wouldn't update. So I can use something a little more clear, and I can refer to the name of the URL instead of the actual URL endpoint. So to do that, inside of urls.py, what I need to do is I need to add a name to add. So basically you just pass in a parameter called name, or an argument called name. and I'll give it the name add. And for the index, I'll give it the name home. So now when I go back to the index.html file, instead of having /add here, I'll put in this. So it's going to be left curly bracket in the %, and then URL, and then the name of the URL. So in this case, it's going to be add, and then a %, and then the right curly bracket. So these curly brackets and percents basically mean that what follows is going to be executed. So it's not HTML anymore. It's something that's going to be evaluated by the app. So in this case, when you have the keyword URL, what follows is it's going to find the URL that has the name add, and it's going to return the endpoint for that URL. And then it's going to just put it in place of these brackets. So these brackets never get rendered to the HTML. This gets executed, the brackets go away, and whatever the result of the execution is, it gets replaced in here. So I'll just show you that. So if I go here, and I may need to start my server again. If I go here and I look at the page source and zoom into add, we see that it has /add/. So basically that URL command figured out what the URL is for the add page, and it put it here for me. So now when I click on the link, it takes me to add. So that was the one link. And this is something that you'll do frequently, but since this particular app is so simple, that's the only thing that I need to do. So now let's move on to the most important part of our app, and that is the model. So the model is basically the code representation of what is in the database. So I'll close out my index file and I'll go to models.py. And what it's doing is the models.py file is going to have a list of classes that represent tables in your database. So if you create a class here, then through the migration progress, it actually gets added to the database, and then you can kind of interact with the database through your code. So for every class that I create, I'm creating a table. So in this case, I want to create a table called entry. So I just type the word entry, and then I need to inherit from models. So I've imported models above. Well, it's imported for me automatically. Models.model with a capital M. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to specify the columns that are going to be in my table, my entry table. So remember, I'm creating a class here, but this represents a table in the database. So this is using the Django ORM. So if you're not familiar with the ORM, it's basically a relationship mapper. So it takes things that are in your Python code, translates them to things that your database can understand, and vice versa. So the objects are your classes, the actual objects that represent a row in your table in Python. Then this ORM will translate those to actual things in your database. So it can translate something like creating a new object by creating a new row in the database, or you can get the rows in the database and then you'll get a list of objects in Python. So you're not working with the database directly. You don't have to write SQL directly unless you really wanted to, but using the ORM allows you to easily go back and forth between the database without having to actually access the database directly. So by defining classes, I'm defining tables in the database. By defining attributes on this class, I'm defining columns in those particular tables. So for my entry table, I'm going to have 2 columns. So that means I need to have 2 attributes in the entry class. So the first attribute is going to be text, and that's basically going to be the text of the entry, whatever I type in. So this is going to be something called a text field. So it's going to be models.textField. And a text field just means I'm going to have text in the database. It's fairly simple. There are a bunch of other fields, and I'll get to them in the section where I cover models. But for our purposes, let's just keep it simple. And in addition to the text, I'm going to have a date. So the date is going to be the date that it was posted. And to be more clear, I'll just put date posted. And then I'll use the date time field. So with this, the D, the T, and the F need to be capitalized. And then I'm going to pass in one parameter and argument. So that parameter is going to be auto underscore add, or auto underscore now underscore add. And I'm going to set that to true. And basically what this is doing for any date or time field is it's going to automatically set the time to be whatever the time is right as you create that object. So the reason why I'm doing this is because every time I create an entry, I want the date to be saved right as I create it. I don't need the date to be anything in the future or the past. It will be the exact time that the entry is created. That's why I have this auto now add here. And then I'm going to define something else. I'm going to define the stir. And the stir is basically a text representation of each object in your model, or these objects correspond to rows in the database. So this is a method. So it takes in self. And I'm simply going to return, let's say, entry number and then blank. And that blank is going to be the ID. So even though you don't see the ID here, it is included when you inherit models.model. And this is basically the primary key for this table. So it's going to be incremented starting from 1, 2, 3, and so on. So I'll save that. And to actually see this model, the fastest way I can do that is by adding it to my admin. So if I import that model that I just created from my models.py file, so from .models, so from the models file in this particular module, import, or in this particular package, I'm going to import that entry class that I just created here. And then I'm going to call something called admin.site_register, and then I'm going to pass an entry. And this will allow me to see the model on the admin dashboard. So if I go back to the admin dashboard, I now see entries here. Now, this isn't spelled correctly. It's entries with an S. And the reason why it does that is because it expects the name for your class to be singular, and then it appends an S onto the end of it. Now, this isn't really a big deal, but I can change that by adding a meta class here and then setting the attribute verbose underscore name underscore plural equal to whatever I want the plural to be. So for this particular case, it will be entries. So if I save that, the server is going to automatically restart every time I hit save, by the way. And go to admin again, we see it changes to entries. So if I click entries, now it's telling me that there's no such table as entries underscore entry. And the reason why I'm getting this error is because even though I've created the model here in Python, it doesn't actually exist in my database yet, which remember is a SQLite database for now. So to handle that, I need to use the migration process. So for that, it's going to be Python manage.py, and then it's going to be make migrations. So make migrations basically will create the things that are going to be migrated, and it adds it into the migrations directory here. So if I click this and go to underscore or 0001 underscore initial.py, we see it created this class for me automatically. And if I look at this class closely, we see that it has the text and the date posted that I added in the class, and it also has the ID. So basically, these are instructions on how to create the table in the database. So when I run migrate, it's going to look at this, basically read these instructions, and create that table in the database for me. So if I run Python manage.py and then migrate, it's actually going to create the database or create the table in my database. So now if I go back to this page when I start the server again, so run server, I can now view the page because I have that in my database now. So if you get that error, just make sure you actually have created the migrations using make migration, and then you actually migrating it. So it's a two-step process. So now it's telling me I have no entries, but if I click add entry here, I can add some text. So this text represents the text that I added for my model here. And then it doesn't show me date posted because I have this auto now add. If I didn't have this, then it will allow me to click the date and update it. But since it's doing it automatically, it's not going to allow me to edit it. So for the text, I'm going to type, "This is my first diary entry." and I'll hit save. And now we see it has entry number 1, and that kind of looks like the stir part. So entry number blank, and because the ID is 1, it has entry number 1. I can create another entry by going to add entry here, and I'll say, this is the second entry in my diary. And I'll hit save. And now I have entry 2 and entry 1. So if I click on entry 1, I see the text, I see delete, save, and I can see the history of it if I actually modified it. And for entry 2, if I take out 1 exclamation point and hit save, and then go back to 2 and hit history, I can see all the changes that were made for that particular one. So now with some data in the database, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you what this looks like when you view your app. So right now it just has some dummy information here that's in the HTML, but I can make this dynamic depending on what is in the database. And I'll show you how to do that in the next video. Okay, so I want to display the actual entries I have in my database here. So to do that, I'll go to my template. So let me close out the things I don't need. I'll go to my template index and I'll look at the part that I want to modify. So we see I have this dummy data here. So it's just basically 3 of these blocks of HTML. So anytime you have repeated things like this in your template with the dummy data, you'll probably have to loop. So if you do it this way, where you create the HTML first and you add in the dynamic parts later, it's pretty easy to see because you just have repeated sections. But if you were to do it at the same time, then perhaps you wouldn't realize that you needed to loop. But of course, you know, as you add the code and run it, then you'll see what you need to do. So here I'm going to be looping over something. So once again, I use the bracket and the %, and I'll just close it out here. And I'm going to be using a for loop. So for something and something else, I'm going to loop. I don't have that something yet, but I'll just put the for there and I'll put the in for here. So you need the beginning and the end for these pairs when you're doing something like this, because instead of returning a single value like URL add, instead it does something. So basically what this does is it's going to loop over whatever I pass in here, which I'll create in a moment, and it's going to put the code in the middle of the brackets here, so between for and in for every loop. So I'll go to my views, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically retrieve the data from my database, pass it to the template, and then loop over that. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called entries, and this is going to represent the entries in my database. So I have 2 so far. And then I'm going to use the entry class. So first I need to import it. So from.models import entry. And with that, I'm going to call objects and then all. And this is basically saying, give me all of the objects for entry and return them to that entries variable. Then I'm going to create another variable called context. And context is going to be a dictionary with entries, and I'm going to pass in entries. So the reason why I'm doing this is because anything that's in the context that I create here is going to be available in the template. So I'll pass context to the template by adding it as a third argument to my render function. And you see the key for entries is going to be entries and the value is going to be value. So by using the same name, I'll be able to use it in the same way that I have it here in my view. And now that I've passed this context to the template, I can go, and I just added it to the wrong one for some reason. So I'm going to copy this and just paste it above. But the process is exactly the same. So I'll just remove it for add because I wanted to modify index, not add. I'll modify add in a moment. But basically I'm getting all the entries here. Then I have the context, and then I'm passing it to the index.html template. So now in the index.html, I can now fill out the rest of this for statement. So for entry in entries. So this is just like a Python loop. So for every entry in entries, and entry is going to be my variable, I'm going to do something. So what I'll do is I'll copy this HTML and I'll paste it inside of this for loop. And when I do that without specifying anything else, what happens is I get these 5 entries now. And the reason why I have 5 is because I have 3 placeholder ones, and then the loop executes twice because I have 2 entries in my database. So that's a total of 5. If I remove the placeholders, I should only have 2 because I have 2 entries in the database. So now what I want is I want the values here to be what's actually in the database. So if I go to the date, instead of having this hard-coded date, I'll use the 2 brackets. And whenever you use the 2 brackets like that, what follows is a simple variable, and that variable gets rendered. So if I type entry, which is the current iteration, dot date, which is, or date posted, which is the name of what I use in the model. So date posted, it's going to take the date posted and inject it into here in between these strong tags. So if I refresh, we see it added the date. So March 12th, 2018, 12:55 p.m. It doesn't look exactly the same as my placeholder, but the information is there. So that's the most important. This can be modified, of course, but this works for our purposes. And then here, instead of the dummy text, I'm going to replace this with entry.text. So just like in the same way, it's going to replace, it's going to inject the text right here into the HTML. So now if I refresh, I now see the actual data from my database. So this is my first diary entry, and this is the second entry in my diary. And I kind of want those in reverse chronological order, so I can change the way that I get the entries in my views. So instead of having all, I can change this to order by, and then minus, meaning reverse or descending, posted. And now when I do this, the order should flip. This is the second entry, and then the first is below it. So I'll explain more about what's going on with this query here, but simply by adding order by and removing the all, it's basically going to take all the results and order by whatever I have here, which is date posted, and I'm just saying order by descending. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward to display data from my database by getting the query, the result of the query, and passing it to the template, and then looping over those results. Now that I can actually see the data from my database, what I want to do now is I want to be able to add data. So right now, this doesn't do anything. So I want to enable this. So to do this, I'm going to create a form. And a form represents kind of an HTML form in Django. So I'm going to create a new file called forms.py. And in this forms.py file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form. So just like the model is kind of a representation, a Python representation of your database, the classes that I'm going to create here are the single class. It's kind of a representation of the HTML form. So I'm going to say from Django.forms, import model form, and then I'm going to import the model that I created. So from .models, import entry. So model form is going to allow me to take a model that I've created and generate a form based off of it. So you can create the form directly, but to save a little time, because I'm not doing anything special with the form, I'm going to create the form from the model. So when I get to the section of forms, I'll show you how to create forms directly, but in this case, I'll just create the form from the model. So I'm going to create a class, and I'll call this entry form, and it's going to take in model form. It's going to inherit from it. And then here, I don't have to define any attributes directly. Instead, what I'll do is I'll create a meta class. And a meta class is just a way to attach additional information to the class that is not the direct attributes of it. So the meta class is some extra information about the entry form. In this case, I want the model for the entry form in the fields for the entry form. And as you can guess, the entry that I imported here, the class, is going to be the model, and the fields are just the fields that I want to display in the form. So I have two fields, text and date posted. I don't need to represent date posted because that's handled for me automatically. So I just want to have the text. So you can pass in a list or tuple of the fields. In this case, I'll just use a tuple, and I'll pass in text, and then I need the comma to make it a tuple. And this is telling model form that basically create a form from this entry model using the field text. If I had more fields, I can add those here, but I don't. I only have the text. So if I save that, now what I want to do is I want to actually show this form in the HTML. So to do this, I'll go back to views, and now I'll go to the add function. I'm going to add something here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate that entry form. So first I need to import it, of course. So from forms, import entry form. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate it. So I'll just call this form, entry form, and then instantiate it. And I need to pass that form to the template. So I'll use the context variable again. And then the key is going to be form. The value is going to be the actual form. And then I'll pass it to the template by sending context. And now inside of add.html, I'll have access to the form. So if I open up add, and if I go down to here where I have the actual text area, the placeholder one, what I like to do is I like to add in the generated form right next to the placeholder one so it's easier to see. So this text area is a placeholder, and I actually want this to be the generated one. So to do that, I'm going to use the double brackets again. That means whatever variable I pass in here is going to be injected directly, and that variable is simply going to be form.text. And what form.text is going to do is it's going to basically inject the code for whatever widget should be displayed. And because in my model, I have a text field, when it gets translated to the form, a text field is basically a text area. You can have something called a car field, which will generate a regular input field. You can have like a date field that I have here. If I were actually displaying it, that would display a little calendar and a little clock so you can set the time, and so on. Each type of field in your model has a corresponding widget that gets displayed in HTML. And I'll get to that later when I get to that section, but just keep that in mind. So if I go back here to my ad, I see I have form.text. So when I refresh the page, I get this text area. So this text area doesn't look anything like what I have here, and that's because this doesn't have the CSS class applied to it, and it has a default number of rows as well. So to handle that, I can modify the form slightly by setting the init. So what I'm going to do is this init is basically going to be in addition to the default init that is inherited in model form. So it's going to take in the arguments and keyword arguments, and it's simply going to add to that. So if I call super init, all this is doing is it's calling the existing init.py. So I need to indent that. So basically, if I stopped here, this does absolutely nothing. It's basically just calling the existing init. But if I add anything to this, then it gets initialized whenever I instantiate the form. So here, I'm instantiating the form. So whatever is in the init will run automatically. And basically what I want to do is I want to update the attributes for that so I can have the class right. So to do this, I'm simply going to set self.fields. So I'm looking for the fields that I have, and the field that I'm interested in is the text field. And I'm going to set this directly. So when you're creating a form in the more traditional way without model form, this is a little bit easier. But because I'm using model form and I don't want the default behavior, I need to modify this slightly. So I'm going to modify the widget, which is that text area. I'm going to set the attributes on it and update them. And basically I can pass in a list or a dictionary of attributes. So class, and the class that I want from my HTML is text area. So class is text area. And then the other thing that I want is I want the placeholder. So if I go here, you see I have a placeholder, what's on your mind. So I'll add that as well. Placeholder. And it's going to be what's on your mind. And that's it. So if I save that and run it again, and I have invalid syntax because I didn't add the colon here. So I'll save that and the server restarts for me. Okay, so it doesn't have the attribute widgets, and that's because it should be singular. So just widget instead of widgets, which makes sense. And now when I view the page again, I see I have two text areas, and the second one actually looks like the first, except it's a little bigger. I'm not really interested in making it smaller because this works for our purposes. I mean, I can adjust it here in the HTML. It's just a default rendering. So now that I have that working, I can remove the placeholder one. So remove that and then refresh. And now I only have the one that's generated for me. So because I don't have form tags, I'll create the form tag here. So form, the method is going to be post. The action is going to be the same endpoint. So I can either leave this blank and it's automatically going to use the same endpoint by default. That's just a feature of HTML. Or I can use the whole URL thing and pass in add as the name, and it's going to do that for me as well. And then I can add the closing form down here. So /form. And this should actually be up one level, right? Nope, that was the right spot. So I'll just indent everything and save this. Okay, so now that I have the form displaying visually, the next thing I want to do is actually taking the information, and I see I just messed up my submit button by changing the form. That's because I don't have a closing tag here. So save that and run. But like I was saying, the next thing I want to do is actually submit this form and get the data and process it in my database. And I'll do that next. Okay, so now to process the form, I'll go back to my views. And inside the views, what I'm going to do is I'm first going to check and see if it is taking a post request. And if it is a post request, I'm going to check if the form is valid. If it's valid, I'll save the form, which saves it to the database, and then I'll redirect to the index so they can see the entry they just added. So to write that code, first thing I'll do is I'll start at the top of this add function. And the first thing, like I said, I need to check and see if this is a post request, because a post request means that they have submitted the form. If it's a GET request, then that means simply display the form. So requests.method is post, so they actually hit submit. Then what I want to do is I want to actually instantiate the form with the data that was passed in from the form. So I'm going to call form, entry form again, and I'm going to use request post. So request.post has all the data that was passed in through the post request. So I'm going to instantiate the form with this data, meaning it's going to start with the text being the text of whatever the user typed in. Then after that, I need to check and see if this data that the user passed in is actually valid. In this particular case, the data is pretty simple, so it's pretty much always going to be valid. But in more complicated cases, it may not necessarily be valid, so you want to check that. So I'm going to call this if statement, if form is underscore valid. I'm going to do something. So if the form is valid, what I want to do is I want to save the form. And by calling save on the form, because this is a model form, it's actually going to take the data that was passed in through the form and automatically save it to the database. So if I weren't using model form, then I have to do a couple of extra steps. But because I'm using model form, it does everything for me. So just form.save. And now the data is saved to my database. And once the data is saved to my database, then I have to think, okay, what do I want to do next? And what I want to do is I want to redirect the user back to the index page so they can see the entry they just added. So if you think about it, if this part is handling saving the data to the database, if I redirect them to the index, that data is going to be in the database by the time they get there, and it's going to query the database for all the entries, so they'll immediately be able to see the entry that they added to the database. So To send them to the index after the add, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a shortcut called redirect, and I'm going to return here. So return, redirect, and then the name of the URL that I'm interested in this particular case, index, because remember in our URLs file, or actually it's home. In this particular case, home, because I want to redirect them to the home page or the index in this case. So if you follow this logically, we're saying that if the form is valid, run form.save. If it isn't valid, then drop down and continue executing here. I don't want to instantiate the form again in this case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an else. And the reason why I'm adding the else is because instantiating the form here is for the case when it's a GET request, meaning they just want to see the form. And then above what I just handled is when they want to actually submit the form. So like I said, following this logically, if the form is invalid, it's going to drop out of this if block because there's no more code. It's going to skip over the else, and it's going to take the form that was created before, pass it to the context, and that gets passed to the template. In the case where it's just a GET request, so the else here, the form gets instantiated with nothing. That form gets passed to the context, and it displays. So with all of that, I should be able to actually save things to the database. So I'll refresh this page and I'll type, this is the third entry in my diary. If I hit submit, I get this error. So it's telling me CSRF verification failed. And the reason why is because when you're submitting a form in Django, you need to pass along a CSRF token. And a CSRF token stands for Cross-Site Request Forgery Token. And that is just so whoever is submitting your form has to submit it from your web page. Because due to the nature of HTTP, they can actually send a request directly to your add URL without actually going through your web page, and you don't want them to be able to do that. So what the CRS token is, it's a unique token that is generated, and it gets injected into the web page, and it gets passed along with the form data, and it gets verified when you use is valid. And basically what this is doing is it ensures that only people viewing your web page are submitting the form, like the form isn't being submitted from elsewhere. So to actually include that token, I'm going to use the brackets here. I need to put this inside of the form. So if I just use curly bracket % and just type CRSF token and then % curly bracket, then this will work. And if I look at the source, I see this input hidden has been added, and it has a value of this random string, and that's the token. So now I can type, this is the third entry to my diary. I hit submit. It redirects me automatically to the home page, and I see already that it has the information there. If I go to add new entry again, here is yet another entry to my diary. And I see it here. So as you can see, that pretty much completes this app. I'm able to view all the entries that I have in my database, and I'm able to create new ones whenever I want to. So this was a quick overview of how to create a Django app, and I know I didn't go into things in great detail, but you can see how easy it can be. And once I go over the other parts of Django, you'll see how you can add those pieces into your project depending on exactly what you want to do. And of course, when I get to the examples, I'll show you how all of these things come together. But that's basically the diary app that I want to show you how to create with Django, just to give you an overview of how Django works. So in the next sections, I'll cover the specifics of Django. And like I said, at the end, I'll create more example applications.